All right, so this is our last lecture of the semester. This is the endocrine system. So when you think endocrine system, you should think hormones, of course, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Hormones that are released from the various endocrine organs throughout the body. So, and when you think of hormones, you can compare it somewhat to what the nervous system does in terms of communicating messages, and that's really where the similarities stop. The endocrine system communicates messages, but the messages are related more towards long-term processes, where the nervous system is generally related more towards short-term types of things. So the endocrine system, the parts are really not connected, right? It's just there are various organs, and the blood is how the messages are sent in terms of being communicated in these longer-term processes like growth, development, and ultimately are releasing chemical messengers, like the nervous system uses chemical messengers, those are neurotransmitters. And here we are using hormones as the chemical messengers, and they pass through the bloodstream to different targets throughout the body and give instructions and alter typically what cells are going to do once they receive instructions from that hormone. So if you look at this slide, this kind of gives you a nice comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system in terms of communication, right? Both are communication, right? One is the communication across synapses, right, where neurotransmitters are released across the synaptic cleft, and they target a receptor, an organ that has a receptor for that neurotransmitter, like skeletal muscle, for instance, right? Skeletal muscle, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine binds to its receptor on the sarcolemma and causes that muscle to then contract, right? We talked about that when we looked at how the muscle works and how there's this neural muscular relationship, and that occurs at the synapse. The endocrine system that we're going to be talking about in this chapter communicates messages, but instead of going across the synaptic cleft, the communication is communicated through the circulatory system. Hormones are released. The chemical messenger is a hormone. It's released from an endocrine organ, travels through the bloodstream and to the target. And the target also must have a receptor for that specific hormone, right? And so again, if we saw previously the neuromuscular junction and how a neurotransmitter basically instructed a skeletal muscle to contract, right? And we saw that process. You can also think about the endocrine system as it relates to skeletal muscle, because the endocrine system can communicate with skeletal muscle as well. One example of that would be insulin, right? Insulin is a hormone that we're going to talk about that's released from the pancreas. It travels through the bloodstream and targets the skeletal muscle. And when it targets the skeletal muscle, instead of instructing the muscle to contract, it's instructing the muscle to pull sugar into itself, right? And we'll talk about that process. But the point is, they're both communicating a message to targets and using sort of different means for that. All right, so as I said, both systems are methods of communication. Endocrine system would be, if you think about the type of communication, would be like writing a letter to someone or sending a letter in the mail, right? It's a slower method of communication. The response is slower, of course, but oftentimes the effect can last longer, whereas the nervous system would be like a phone call or a quick email or something, very fast method of communication and rapid response, but once that is message is communicated, that's it, it's over. Whereas you see some of these effects of the endocrine system tend to linger and last a little bit longer than just an immediate response. All right? So that's a big difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So again, this endocrine system is really based on communication, right? Using hormones or chemicals into the bloodstream to alter really metabolically what that target is doing, right? So for instance, as we talked about, insulin is going to target skeletal muscle, and it's going to alter how much sugar that muscle is pulling into itself, right? It's going to promote what's called the GLUT4 transport protein that's going to pull sugar into its target and out of the bloodstream. It provides a very valuable benefit for the body, obviously, by lowering the amount of sugar in the blood. So it's using these chemicals to alter metabolic activities of the target, right? And so target cells then are specific cells that have the ability to read the hormonal message, what it's saying, right? It has to have a receptor in order to read that message. And the hormone then is going to communicate that message and alter what that target is doing metabolically. So first we're going to talk about how the system actually works and how the communication is generally achieved using hormones, and then we'll look specifically at the primary endocrine organs and the hormones that they secrete. So we'll be looking at the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the parathyroid gland, the thyroid gland, the adrenals, and then we'll end up with the pancreas. The organs with secondary endocrine functions like the heart, for instance, or the kidneys, those will be more AMP2 topics, and we'll talk about those at that time. So this is more, these primary endocrine function organs is what we'll spend our time looking at. All right, so first thing we need to do is understand how hormones work in general before we can look specifically at all the different endocrine organs and the hormones they release. So generally, we can classify these chemical messengers, these hormones that are going to travel through our bloodstream, into three categories: amino acid derivatives, peptide hormones, and lipid derivatives. And most hormones circulate freely through the bloodstream and they arrive at their target and have their effect. Some, though, travel bound to what are called carrier proteins or transport proteins that sort of, chauffeur them, if you will, or guide them to the appropriate location in the body. Okay, and so if you look at the slide, you can see the three categories: amino acid, peptide, and lipid derivative. And their structure, their chemical structure of these hormones can help indicate how they're going to have an effect at the target. Okay? So for instance, these peptide hormones are a pretty large class of hormones, and most of these are going to bind at the cell membrane and initiate sort of a cascade of events that will then cause changes inside the target, which will lead to the desired effect that will occur. Okay? But then, for instance, lipid derivatives, like steroid hormones, these are lipid sort of base structure hormones. They can actually diffuse right through the lipid in the membrane of the cell, and they can go directly into the cell. So steroid hormones, like testosterone, for instance, can find their receptor directly inside the cell instead of, as the peptide hormones we saw, typically bind to the cell membrane. So we'll look at that process as well. All right, so hormones, again, enter the bloodstream throughout the body, typically remain functional for less than an hour and become inactivated typically when it binds to its receptor. Ultimately, it will be broken down in the liver, the kidneys primarily, and then can be recycled, and the process will then start over. As I said, thyroid and steroid hormones, these are ones that typically are bound to transport proteins, right? And when they're bound to transport proteins, they can typically remain in the circulation longer because of the binding to these transport proteins. So as I said, in order for the hormone to have an effect, the target needs to have a receptor for that specific hormone. The receptor is a protein molecule of some kind which that will then bind to strongly. And when it binds, it will have an impact on that target. Okay? And so to affect a target cell, hormone first must interact with its receptor, right? And then those receptors, as I said, are either located on the cell membrane or they're actually inside the cell. It could be in the nucleus, for instance, which we call a nuclear receptor. It could be in the mitochondria, which we call a mitochondrial receptor. It could just be in the cytoplasm, cytoplasmic receptor. But the point is that it's inside the cell. The receptor is not on the cell membrane. So those are the two sort of pathways we want to look at in terms of how hormones can impact the target. They need to bind at the receptor, and the receptor is either going to be on the membrane of the cell target or it's going to be inside the cell of that target. All right, so catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, peptide hormones, those classes of hormones, which is a lot of hormones in the body, bind to receptor proteins on the cell membrane. And so since they're binding at the cell membrane, what they're doing is really sort of initiating a series of steps that will then happen, kind of like a domino effect, or in science we call it a cascade of events, right, where one thing happens that causes the next thing to happen, which causes the next thing to happen. That's what happens when it binds at the cell membrane. The hormone acts as what we call a first messenger, which then causes the appearance of a secondary messenger and then can have an impact on the target. So these hormones do not have what we call a direct effect, right? It's more of an indirect effect that it's going to have on the target. Okay? Secondary messengers, then once they're activated, are going to typically be an enzyme activator, could be an inhibitor or a cofactor also, but that is ultimately the secondary messenger is what's going to carry out the effect, the desired effect the hormone is trying to have at the target. And so there are many different secondary messengers. Cyclic AMP is one that we'll look at, calcium, IP3, DAG, these types of secondary messengers. We'll look at how those work. So before we look at that process, we need to understand that there are ways you can sort of magnify or minimize the effect of a hormone. One way to magnify the effect of the hormone on a target cell is through a process called amplification. And amplification means that when you have a small number of hormone, that's going to lead to thousands of secondary messengers responding inside the cell. So you can see, even if it's just a small amount of hormone, the process, the impact is amplified because there's so many secondary messengers will respond to that. So amplification can happen. You can also see downregulation or upregulation. If a downregulation is a binding that causes the cell to be less sensitive, upregulation is this binding causes it to be more sensitive. So it's not always just sort of a one-for-one effect. Depending on how the receptor is oriented and how it responds may impact how widespread or significant the effect is. All right, so when a hormone binds to the cell membrane, as I said, we call it the first messenger because it's really not having a direct effect on the target. And so once that binds, in order to get the secondary messenger, we need this G protein to become active. And G protein is an enzyme complex bound to that memory receptor that becomes activated when the hormone binds at the cell membrane surface. So it's sort of like first the hormone binds, that activates the G protein, and then the secondary messenger is activated. So this G protein is important because then once the G protein is activated, that can activate what's called adenylate cyclase, which would impact cyclic AMP levels, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Cyclic AMP, okay? Or it can impact the movement of calcium ions, could also inhibit activity of the cell. So the G protein is sort of, once this becomes activated, then it's going to cause the secondary messenger to become activated. Okay? And so cyclic AMP, as we said, is a really important secondary messenger. And if you see increased cyclic AMP levels inside the cell, you're going to see an increase in metabolic activity at that target. And so adenylate cyclase is something that increases activity of cyclic AMP within a target. And so that's from this first pathway, we're going to see how that process works. And so impacting cyclic AMP being the secondary messenger, is something that is fairly common in these pathways that we're going to be looking at. So the first thing to look at is what's happening when the hormone binds at the cell membrane. As we said, the hormone binds to receptors, the G protein becomes activated. When the G proteins become activated, one thing that can happen is to increase cyclic AMP levels in the cell. You do this by activating what's called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase then increases cyclic AMP, which acts as a secondary messenger. Secondary messenger cyclic AMP can then cause ion channels to open or activate enzymes. And if you see cyclic AMP increase, okay, you're going to see many enzymes and ion channels that are activated, thereby accelerating the metabolic activity of that target. So this is how epinephrine and norepinephrine, for instance, one of their pathways, calcitonin, PTH, glucagon, a lot of insulin, a lot of hormones are using the same pathway of cyclic AMP in terms of activating cell, having a sort of a revving up of the cellular activity. Okay? G protein can depending on the hormone, could also break down cyclic AMP, right? In those instances, G protein activation results in decreased level of cyclic AMP, which will have an inhibitory effect at the target. So sometimes, depending on the receptor, like alpha-2 receptors, right, like a smooth muscle, for instance, that's going to cause that inhibition of that smooth muscle, which will cause relaxation, or in some cases be dilation, right? So vasodilation, for instance, could occur in that pathway. So cyclic AMP is a really important secondary messenger. And again, depending on what happens to cyclic AMP, you're going to see your effect. If cyclic AMP levels go up, then obviously you're going to increase the metabolic activity and you're going to increase that activity of that cell. If cyclic AMP levels go down, you're going to see reduced activity in that cell and have more of an inhibitory effect. So there really are two ways that you can impact cyclic AMP. Now another way is to use calcium as a secondary messenger. Okay? And when the hormone binds to receptor, G protein is activated, that can open calcium ion channels, but also cause the release of stored calcium, and the calcium then can act as a secondary messenger where it will combine with calmodulin to increase enzyme activity. Okay, so alpha-1 receptors, oxytocin, certain hypothalamic hormones are going to use this pathway. So basically you have different ways that when a hormone binds, you can increase or have an impact at that target. And this is what happens when the hormone binds at the cell membrane. Okay, so you have those two pathways. Now, as I said, some hormones do not need to bind at the cell membrane. Right? They find their receptors inside the cell. So those are called intracellular receptors. Okay? So these types of hormones can just diffuse right across the cell membrane. Okay, a great example of that is testosterone. Testosterone is one of those lipid-based hormones. Because it's lipid-based, it can diffuse right through the lipid in the membrane and go directly into the cell. When they go directly into the cell, they can then alter DNA transcription in the nucleus and directly affect metabolic activity at that target. So steroid hormones, as I said, like testosterone works this way. Thyroid hormone, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, also works this way, where they can diffuse directly into the cell. And so here is illustration showing how that works, right? You have the hormone diffusing right through the cell. It doesn't need to bind at the cell membrane and activate a G protein and then cyclic AMP and all that stuff. This one just goes directly into the cell and is going to find its receptor either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. When it does that, it can impact gene activation, transcription, translation, and then ultimately get your target response. So again, if this is a muscle, for instance, right? Testosterone is going to go directly into the cell, alter the rate of transcription and translation and protein synthesis, and you're going to impact that muscle. All right, so that's an example of intracellular binding. So make sure you have a good understanding of when a hormone binds with the cell membrane, and those couple pathways we talked about, and then also when a hormone bypasses that and goes directly into the cell, understand that pathway as well. All right, so now that we understand how hormones work and how they communicate messages based on their chemical structure, either binding at the cell membrane or going directly into the cell, we can now start just taking it sort of organ by organ and looking at these endocrine organs and the hormones they release and what effect they have. Okay, and so the first one I want to look at is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland, also referred to as the hypophysis, as you guys know, lies within the sella turcica. Sella turcica is the bony structure of the sphenoid that creates the hypophyseal fossa, which is where the pituitary gland resides. As you know, the pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus via what's called the infundibulum. And you'll see this neuroendocrine relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and that's what we're going to talk about. The pituitary gland releases 9 peptide hormones. These hormones, again, bind to the cell membrane, of course, because they're peptide hormone chemical structure, and primarily use cyclic AMP pathway that we talked about as a secondary messenger system. All right. So the pituitary gland can be divided into 2 lobes. You have an anterior lobe or adrenal hypophysis, and you have a posterior lobe. And as you can see, you have this infundibulum that attaches up to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus typically is going to send messages down to the anterior lobe or the posterior lobe, and then the hormones are then released from those parts. There are 7 coming from the anterior lobe, 2 coming from the posterior lobe, giving a total of 9 hormones being released in total from the pituitary gland. Okay? So we'll do the anterior lobe first. The anterior lobe, again, also referred to as the adenohypophysis, has hormones that turn on endocrine glands at other locations throughout the body. And they use this fenestrated capillary system where the hypothalamic neurons release these regulatory components through these fenestrated capillaries. And the portal vessels then link down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and essentially you have one regulatory hormone coming from the hypothalamus, which is going to be released and then cause a second hormone to then be released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So you have sort of this 1-2 punch where you get hormones being released from here that travel down this portal system down to the anterior lobe. That's your first hormone, and then when that arrives there, your second hormone is then released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Okay? So that's what we want to look at first and see how that process works. So the hypothalamic hormone, primary one we're going to look at is what's called a releasing hormone, or an RH. A releasing hormone, like it sounds, is going to stimulate synthesis and secretion of these hormones from the anterior lobe. Okay, once that hormone's been released, an inhibiting hormone will then prevent further release of that hormone from the anterior lobe. Okay, and so these hormones then that are released at the impetus of the hypothalamus are then released from the adenohypophysis, and we call those ones trumpet hormones because then they typically target other endocrine glands at other parts of the body. So those hormones are TSH, ACTH, gonadotropins, which there are 2 of those, FSH and LH, prolactin, GH, and MSH, right? So these are the 7 that are coming from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Okay? So the first one is TSH. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, released from the adenohypophysis. It will not be released from the adenohypophysis until it has a hormone from the hypothalamus, and that hormone is TRH. So TRH is first released. That then causes the release of TSH. Right? TSH then goes from the anterior lobe of the pituitary and targets, as you guess it, since it's called thyroid stimulating hormone, that targets the thyroid. I'm going to write this out here, the thyroid gland. Right? The thyroid gland, as you know, is an endocrine organ itself. It targets the thyroid gland and ultimately stimulates the release of thyroid hormone. So as you can see, if the thyroid gland is going to release its hormones, it's not going to do it on its own. First, the hypothalamus is going to realize we need thyroid hormone and release TRH. That will arrive at the anterior pituitary, which will then cause release of TSH. TSH will travel through the bloodstream and target the thyroid, which will then cause the release of the thyroid hormone. Okay? And once you have thyroid hormone in the bloodstream, then you're going to get a negative feedback, which will diminish TRH and TSH, and you'll be in business. Okay? So that's how this system works. And if you understand that system, you can pretty much apply that same concept to the rest of the hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. You always have to have an RH first from the hypothalamus, and then you get the hormone release, which will then target an endocrine gland. All right, next one is ACTH. ACTH is called adrenal corticotropic hormone. It is released at the adenohypophysis in response to CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. So same thing. Starts with the hypothalamus releasing CRH. That causes ACTH to be released. And then ACTH targets the adrenal cortex, which is going to release hormones that are going to impact glucose metabolism, like glucocorticoids, basically. And then once you get those glucocorticoid hormones in level, you get negative feedback and slows that process. So again, it's all about homeostasis, right? Achieving the right amount of hormones in the body. And once you do that, the negative feedback slows that process, and once again, you're in business. Okay? Gonadotropins, similar process. You have 2 hormones, FSH and LH, that are released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. but they're only released in response to GnRH from the hypothalamus. FSH promotes follicle development and stimulates the release of estrogen. LH induces ovulation, also promotes estrogen and progestins to be released. So gonadotropin's working in the same fashion. Okay? Prolactin is released in response from PRH from the hypothalamus. This stimulates mammary gland development and milk production. Growth hormone, same thing. GHRH from the hypothalamus causes the release of growth hormone, which stimulates cell growth and replication, really targets a lot of cells throughout the body like skeletal muscle, other locations. And then finally, melanocyte-stimulating hormone is released and stimulates melanocyte activity. Okay? And so here you can see how that works, right? It starts with an RH from the hypothalamus, which then gets the hormone released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary, which then targets the endocrine organ, and then the endocrine organ will then release the hormone throughout the body. Okay? And then this slide does a nice job of summarizing, right? You start, again, with a regulatory hormone from the hypothalamus, which then causes ACTH, for instance, which targets the adrenal cortex, which is going to release your glucocorticoids, for instance, right? Thyroid gland, right? TRH is going to be released from the hypothalamus. TSH stimulates the thyroid gland, and you get thyroid hormones T3 and T4 release, which we're going to talk about. And so this slide does a really nice job of summarizing how this works and all the targets, etc., from that standpoint. All right, and then this is a nice summary again of starting here with the hormone coming from the hypothalamus, then you get the hormone from the adenohypophysis, what it targets, and then what ultimately the effect is. So these are really nice of all the anterior lobe hormones: TSH, ACTH, FSH, LH, prolactin, GH, and MSH, right? And so there are your 7 hormones from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Now the posterior lobe, as I said, releases 2 hormones. And instead of having this sort of 1-2 punch, the hypothalamus and the adenohypophysis that we described just a moment ago, the posterior lobe really acts a little bit differently. The hormones are directly coming from the hypothalamus. And there are 2 hormones, as I said, and those are ADH and oxytocin. ADH is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin is also released. And these hormones move from the hypothalamus down to the posterior lobe of the pituitary via what's called axoplasmic transport. Okay, and that is then released at the posterior lobe. So instead of the 1-2 punch that we saw in the anterior lobe, the hormones are being directly released from the hypothalamus and then directly released at the posterior lobe. So the 2 hormones again, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic, just like it sounds, is the opposite of what a diuretic. A diuretic helps you lose fluid. Antidiuretic is going to help you hold on to fluid. So it primarily targets the kidneys and diminishes the amount of water loss in the kidneys. And so, for instance, you have a drop in blood pressure, right? One of the things that your body will do is release ADH. There are many processes to try to help achieve blood pressure balance. One of these is to release ADH if your blood pressure gets too low, which is going to try to help you hold on to more fluid. Okay? Oxytocin is the second of the 2 hormones released from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Oxytocin is going to be a really important hormone we're going to talk about in reproduction and development. In pregnant women, oxytocin promotes labor and delivery. It stimulates the smooth muscle of the uterus to contract. And in afterbirth, oxytocin also promotes injection of milk from the mammary glands. That's known as a neuroendocrine reflex because you have an infant nursing, which there's a pathway directly up to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is stimulated then, of course, and releases oxytocin. Oxytocin then goes down to the breast and milk is released. Okay? And so again, since it travels through the hypothalamus, which is this very significant regulatory center in the body, other things, just other than just the infant nursing, can potentially trigger this milk letdown reflex. So stress, anxiety. I've even heard some women describe that hearing another baby cry, right, can stimulate this milk letdown reflex because those are impacting the hypothalamus. So that's oxytocin. So those are the two from the posterior lobe. You have ADH, right? And you can see direct release of hormones from the posterior lobe via these nuclei, right? And then ADH and oxytocin and what they're targeting, all right? And then here's a nice summary of that too, right? Posterior lobe, ADH, oxytocin, their target, the effect. And again, there is no regulatory hormone from the hypothalamus because these are transported along the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei directly to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. All right. So those are the 9 hormones of the pituitary, so make sure you have a good understanding of how those work and all the different functions and effects they have. All right, so on to the next one. The next endocrine organ we want to look at is the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is a gland, and we've talked a little bit about this. You recall from your early studies in this semester when we looked at all the major organs in the body. The thyroid gland was one of them, and it sits directly below the Adam's apple or the larynx, and is divided, if you look at it from a histological section, into what are called thyroid follicles. And these are hollow spheres lined by cuboidal epithelium that surround this, what we call follicular cavity, which is ultimately where, in these cuboidal cells and in the follicular cavity, where the hormone, the thyroid gland hormones, are manufactured. Okay? And so the highly vascularized structure, because these capillaries can deliver nutrients and hormones that stimulate the formation. So here you can see the thyroid gland right sitting just below the Adam's apple. And the two primary hormones that come from these cuboidal cells in the thyroid gland are T3 and T4. And they're called T3 and T4 based on the number of iodide ions that they're attached to their structure. Iodine ions are essential to the formation of the hormone, and so they're delivered to the thyroid cuboidal cells via the diet. They arrive in the capillaries and ultimately form these T3 and T4. So here's a nice image of the thyroid gland, and you can see all of these thyroid follicles, right? And you can see how they're lined with cube-shaped cells. Okay? And here's a little bit closer look at it. And here's a nice illustration also where you can see the follicular cavity, but then you can also see these cube-shaped cells where the T3 and T4 are going to be manufactured. Okay, so how does it work? How are they manufactured? Well, iodide ions, as we said, are essential to the formation. You need these to form T3 and T4 hormones. So the iodide ions are delivered from the diet to the thyroid gland, and they attach to these molecules of tyrosine, which ultimately go through a series of processes giving you T3 and T4. And then, of course, TSH, as you know from the adrenal hypothesis, will stimulate the release of these thyroid hormones out in the bloodstream. Okay, and this image does a nice job of sort of showing the process, right? Here is one of those cube-shaped cells, right? Here's the follicular cavity up here. And you can see the iodide ions are delivered into the follicular cell via the bloodstream because you get iodide ions from your diet. They're fused in, they combine with tyrosine and thyroglobulin, and ultimately go through a series of steps, including lysosomal digestion, and you end up with T3 and T4. When TSH arrives, it will stimulate the release of T3 and T4 out into the bloodstream. And actually, if you recall, I said there are certain hormones that are bound to carrier proteins. We talked about steroid hormones and thyroid hormones. Here you can see that. These carrier proteins, TBG, transthyretin, and albumin, bind to these hormones, T3 and T4, and then again, carry them to their appropriate location throughout the body. So T3 and T4 diffuse across the basement membrane when TSH stimulates them to do so, right? So TSH is really important there when they enter the bloodstream. 90% of thyroid secretion is T4. Okay? And they then bind to these different transport proteins which are in your plasma, and then they're delivered to the locations throughout the body. Okay, and this sort of is a nice chart showing how it works, right? Homeostasis is the goal, normal T3 and T4 levels in the body. Let's say you don't have enough T3 and T4, right? Concentrations are low, or if your body temperature is low, hypothalamus is going to release TRH down to the adrenal hypophysis. The adenohypophysis then is going to release TSH. TSH travels down to the thyroid gland, which then, as you know, stimulates the release of T3 and T4, and then you're back in business, back to homeostasis. So that's a nice slide sort of showing how thyroid secretion is regulated by the hypothalamus and the adenohypophysis. All right, so what do these thyroid hormones do? Well, they find their target through these transport proteins, as I said, and they really affect most of the cells in the body. They go directly into the cell. They do not bind at the cell membrane, so they're going to find their receptor in the cytoplasm, in the mitochondria, in the nucleus, and be very impactful in terms of all these cellular processes. In fact, in children, it's essential for development. Without these thyroid hormones, you're going to see skeletal, muscular, nervous system deficiencies, which could be very detrimental on the health of the developing child. So really important effect of these thyroid hormones. And these thyroid hormones are thought to have a calorogenic effect, meaning that when you have more T3 and T4, you're impacting metabolism across the board. These cells are becoming more metabolically active as a result. And so when a cell is more metabolically active, it's going to consume more energy and then produce more heat, right? And so that's one of the reasons people that have, say, an overactive thyroid gland producing a lot of heat because of this increased metabolic activity. They may have a sort of elevated resting body temperature, might feel hot and sweaty a lot and not able to relax because they increase cellular metabolism. Okay? So these are the things you're going to see with thyroid hormones and the effect they're going to have on all these cells. Again, because they're more metabolically active, oxygen consumption is going to go up, energy consumption, see a change in body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, sensitivity to sympathetic stimulation, activity of other endocrine cells, turnover in bone, lots of effects you're going to see in metabolism across the board in all these cells through our body because of these T3 and T4 hormones. Okay? Now, what happens if you have too much or not enough of this T3 and T4 hormone? Well, too little is what's called hypothyroidism, right? And based on what I just said, you can probably draw the conclusion that, okay, if we don't have enough T3 and T4, we're not going to be stimulating metabolism, my metabolic activity is going to be low, probably going to be reducing heat. So what would be responsive to that? Well, you might feel cool all the time, not really able to warm up. You may not be very energetic. You might feel tired a lot. And that is what happens to someone who does not have enough thyroid hormone in their system. They're going to feel like that. Again, in children, it's much more severe of an effect. You can see a significant impact on skeletal and nervous development. So really important from that standpoint. But the other extreme then is too much production of thyroid hormone, right? And again, based on what I told you what thyroid hormone does in normal levels, just multiply that, right? So metabolic rate is going to be going way up. And so, as I said, body temperature is going to go up. You're probably going to have to perspire. You may have a sense of just sort of restlessness and all the sympathetic stimulation, blood pressure, heart rate. And so that's what's happening with hyperthyroidism. So those are your sort of two extremes with these T3 and T4. Now, T3 and T4 are not the only hormones released from the thyroid gland. There's actually a different type of cell called a C cell that is releasing the hormone called calcitonin. And we talked about calcitonin back when we looked at the skeletal system, because the skeletal system houses lots of calcium. And so calcitonin is going to be released in response to when your blood calcium is getting too low. So it comes from these C cells, or what are called parafollicular cells. And when calcium concentrations go up, right, calcitonin is going to be released. So again, like anything else, there's an ideal range of calcium in your blood. You don't want that to be too high. You don't want it to be too low. When the amount of calcium in the blood gets too high, okay, calcitonin is going to be released. Calcitonin then will target the bone by slowing osteoclast activity, which is obviously then going to slow release of calcium in the blood, and also can lose calcium at the kidneys. So it may stimulate release of calcium at the kidneys and the tubule system, and then your blood calcium comes back to the normal range. Okay. All right, so that is the thyroid gland. Now, continuing on with that same topic of blood calcium, you have what are called the parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands, there are 4 of them. They're embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, and they release PTH, or parathyroid hormone. Okay? And parathyroid hormone is the antagonist to calcitonin. If calcitonin can bring your blood calcium levels down, then you probably need something that can bring your blood calcium levels up if they get too low, and that's what PTH does. And we talked about this calcitonin-PTH relationship back when we did the skeletal system, but we'll just review it here again real quick. Okay, so you can see the the parathyroid glands are 4 nodules embedded on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland, and here's a histological section where you can see a lot of thyroid follicles, and then here is a parathyroid gland right there. Okay, and there's zooming in on that, you can see the parathyroid chief cells that are going to release this PTH. And so PTH, again, is trying to get blood calcium back up. So it's going to stimulate osteoclasts, right? Because if you stimulate osteoclasts, you're going to accelerate bone turnover. When you break down bone, you're going to release calcium in the blood, and your calcium level is going to go up. It can also reduce what's lost at the kidneys, giving you more calcium, and ultimately get your blood calcium back to normal. And so this slide, again, just sort of demonstrates what we talked about, right? Normal blood calcium is 8.5 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. That's homeostasis, okay? If your amount of calcium in your blood gets too high, right, thyroid gland can produce calcitonin, which is going to help you lower blood calcium by inhibiting osteoclasts primarily and losing more at the kidneys, right? If your blood calcium gets too low, parathyroid gland is going to release PTH. PTH is then going to stimulate osteoclasts to break down more calcium, or break down the bone and release more calcium, maybe absorb more calcium also in the diet and lose less at the kidneys, and ultimately your blood calcium is going to come back up, right? And so that's a nice homeostatic process, right? And they're working in opposition to one another to achieve homeostasis. All right? All right, so that's the parathyroid gland. Next we want to look at are the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands, also referred to as the suprarenal glands, because they sit right on top of each kidney, right? And so the adrenal glands have a lot of functionality, and we can learn about that functionality by seeing the different regions of the adrenal glands themselves. And you have the superficial, what's called adrenal cortex, and then you have this inner core called the adrenal medulla. Okay, the cortex is manufacturing primarily steroid hormones, whereas the adrenal medulla is regulated by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and producing our adrenaline hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine that then are going to then stimulate skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle and smooth muscle to give you that fight or flight type of response. That's what we call the adrenaline hormones, right? So that's what we're going to look at. And so here you can see the adrenal glands, or suprarenal glands, right, because they're sitting right on top of the kidney. And if you take a cross section through it, right, you can see the cortex is this part here, and then the medulla is in the center. Okay? And the cortex can be divided into 3 regions: glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. Okay? The glomerulosa is producing mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, which is going to be part of the process of helping achieve maintaining blood pressure, right? It can stimulate conservation of sodium and increase sensitivity of salt, and it's going to help us hold on to fluid a little bit, and so it's going to be part of the process in regulating blood pressure. The fasciculata is releasing glucocorticoids like cortisol. It's stimulated by ACTH, accelerates sugar formation and glycogen formation, but also has an anti-inflammatory effect, like hydrocortisone, right? That's cream that you rub on like poison ivy and rashes and things like that, right? Because it has an anti-inflammatory effect as well. And so that's coming from that zona fasciculata, which is the middle region of the adrenal cortex. And then finally have the reticularis, which is also producing under stimulation of ACTH as well. And so there you can see those 3 layers. So the glomerulosa is towards the top, Spiculatus in the middle, and the reticularis is closest to the medulla. Now the medulla, as I said, is the center portion of the adrenal gland, and this is controlled specifically by the sympathetic division of the ANS, right? Sympathetic division is your fight or flight response, right? And so the two secretions that are being produced are epinephrine and norepinephrine. The vast majority, 75 to 80%, are epinephrine, and they are giving you that fight or flight response, right? Increasing heart rate, blood pressure, sugar utilization, all those things you associate with fight or flight are being stimulated at the adrenal medulla. Okay? And so the activation of the adrenal medulla from the sympathetic division is going to do all those things we've already talked about associated with sympathetic stimulation, right? Skeletal muscle, it's going to trigger sugar availability so you can make ATP, right? ATP fats also can be used to make ATP. In the liver, glycogen can be broken down again to give more sugar, not available only for muscle, but also for nervous tissue, which cannot use fats, it can only use sugar. We'll see an increase in heart rate, force of cardiac contraction, which is going to correspond with an increase in blood pressure, things like that. So this is a nice chart showing all these different sections, right? You have the cortex here and those three parts, the hormonal effect, how they're regulated, and then you have the medulla, which is sympathetic stimulation, and their effects that you're seeing in epinephrine, norepinephrine, things like that. So it's a nice chart to summarize all the things that we just described. All right. All right. So that's the adrenal gland. On to the pineal gland. Pineal gland. Well, we've talked about this a little already. The nervous system. So all you need to know is that these pineal glands, of course, found in the brain and the epithalamus. Contains pinealocytes, which synthesize the hormone melatonin. And melatonin, primarily, we talked about how it influences our circadian rhythms and sort of our day, night, wake, sleep cycles. And there you can see it, right? Next to the corpora quadrigemini, you have the pinealocytes, which are secreting melatonin. So that's pretty much all you need to do for the pineal gland. All right, on to the pancreas. Pancreas is really unique organ. We are going to obviously talk about its endocrine function, but it's important to know that actually the vast majority of the pancreas is also involved in digestion, or what we call the exocrine pancreas. So the pancreas actually has this dual function in two different organ systems, right? It's involved in digestion, and actually significantly so, as 99% of the cells of the pancreas are involved in digestion, so we call it the exocrine pancreas. And there's also this thing called the endocrine pancreas. The endocrine pancreas is a much smaller subset, only about 1% of the cells. These are called islet cells that secrete hormones. And so that's what we're going to focus on. But again, it's important to understand the relationship between the two. So here's the pancreas. As you can see, it's situated very closely to the first part of the small intestine, which is known as the duodenum. And you can see this long pancreatic duct, which is going to produce, again, the vast majority of its secretions are going to drop into the small intestine, which is going to help with digestion, but also neutralization of acidity, and get those components knocked out. So exocrine pancreas, again, clusters of cells called what are called acini cells. These acini cells then deliver their secretions into ducts. We ultimately call their secretions pancreatic juice, right? And this pancreatic juice is an alkaline, enzyme-rich fluid that helps with digestion and neutralization of acidity, like I talked about, and is about 99% of the pancreatic volume. So again, the vast majority of the pancreas is actually involved in digestion. Okay, and we'll talk more about that when we do the digestive system in AMP2. So for now, what I want to focus on is the endocrine pancreas, the 1% of cells known as islet cells, or islets of Langerhans cells, that produce hormones. And there are 4 different types of islet cells: alpha, beta, delta, and F cells. We are going to focus on alpha and beta cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon, beta cells produce insulin. And so we want to look at those processes and see how that works. And so here's a nice shot of the acini cells, which is the vast majority, right? The acini cells are 99% of the pancreas, make up 99% of the pancreas, but the islet cells are sort of in clusters, and these make up just about 1% of the pancreatic volume. All right, so what we want to focus on then are the hormones insulin and glucagon coming from the alpha and beta cells, right? And they both, insulin and glucagon, kind of like PTH and calcitonin, regulated blood calcium levels. Insulin and glucagon regulate blood sugar levels, right? You don't want your blood sugar to be too high, you don't want your blood sugar to be too low, and these hormones help maintain a nice homeostatic balance of blood sugar, okay? And so basically, when blood sugar goes up, right, like when you've had a donut and a soda and, you know, something else that has a lot of sugar in it, right, you're going to absorb that, digest it, get that sugar into your bloodstream, and in response to that, the beta cells are going to secrete insulin, which is going to stimulate the movement and transfer of that sugar across plasma membranes of like skeletal muscle and liver, getting them out of the blood and into those organs, and thereby lowering the amount of sugar in your blood, because you're putting the sugar somewhere else, putting it in muscle, putting it in liver, getting it out of the blood. Okay? The opposite is true when your blood sugar levels go down. When would your blood sugar levels go down? Well, say you woke up one day and you were late and you didn't have time to eat breakfast and you had to go to class and you had to go to work and you just didn't have time to really get too much good food in your system. And so your sugars are probably pretty low because you haven't ingested much sugar. And so these alpha cells can release glucagon, which is going to stimulate glucose release by the liver. The liver can actually manufacture and release some sugar out into our bloodstream to try to help us from getting too low in terms of our blood sugar until we can get food and a meal that's going to help maintain get those sugars back up. Right? So those are they have this opposing effect to one another to achieve normal blood sugar. Right? And so we've seen these charts before. Normal blood sugar, which now is pretty easy to measure, right? You can go to Walgreens and buy a glucometer where you get a little prick of blood in your fingertip, put it on a little strip, feed it in the machine, and it's going to give you what your current blood sugar is. And normal blood sugar, homeostatic blood sugar, amount of sugar in your blood is 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. If your blood sugar goes up, right, because again, you had a donut and a soda and a couple other things that have a lot of sugar in it. In response to that, the beta cells are going to secrete insulin. We need to get the insulin's going to basically instruct the muscle and the liver to pull sugar out of the blood and pull it into their cells. Once it's into their cells, the muscle, for instance, can use the sugar to make ATP, or it can store the sugar as glycogen. Either way, you're getting it out of the blood, into the muscle and the liver, and you get back to homeostasis. Again, if your blood sugar gets too low, you haven't something to eat for a long time, and you couldn't get to any food, and so your blood sugar goes down, right? In response to that, the alpha cells secrete glucagon. This increases breakdown of glycogen to glucose in the liver and skeletal muscle. Sugar is dumped into the bloodstream, and then your blood sugar goes back up, right? And so this is achieving homeostasis of blood sugar. Okay, so insulin is a peptide hormone released by the beta cells and impacts target cells like the muscle and the liver in all of these manners, right? Accelerates glucose uptake and utilization, stimulates glycogen formation, right? Glycogen is the storage form of glucose, okay? And all these things are then going to get sugar out of the blood and into those targets. And this sort of shows how it works. This is an illustration of a islet cell, right? A beta cell, okay? And when sugar is received, right, in your bloodstream near the pancreas, okay, the pancreas has a GLUT2 receptor on the surface of those islet cells, brings the sugar in and sets off a series of reactions that ultimately is going to result in insulin release. So it's responding directly to the amount of sugar in your blood. When sugar goes up, the pancreas figures this out, pulls some sugar into its cell, and causes release of insulin. Okay? Insulin is then released into the bloodstream, travels through the bloodstream, and then say it comes to muscle, right? This is your muscle. This is your sarcolemma membrane, so this is outside the cell, this is inside the cell. And there are insulin receptors on your muscle for insulin. When the insulin receptor is activated, You're going to see changes in gene expression and regulation, which is going to stimulate these GLUT4 receptors to pull the sugar into the cell. Once the sugar is into the cell and out of the blood, the sugar can be utilized to make ATP, or it can be used to store sugar, right? It can make glycogen or triglycerides, things like that, right? Either way, it's getting out of the blood, and the muscle can handle it much easier, all right? So that is glucose uptake. And so that's another reason why, and we'll talk about this in a minute with diabetes, sugar exercise, for instance, is so effective at helping people regulate blood sugar, because it forces your body to use the sugar, right? Because if you need to exercise, you need to produce ATP, and a great, as we've talked about, an easy source of ATP production is from glucose or sugar, and so it forces that sugar to be pulled out of the bloodstream into the muscle where it can be used to make ATP. All right, so glucagon is the opposite, released by alpha cells, mobilizes the sugar, breaks down glycogen to glucose, which can be released into the bloodstream, and your sugar is going to go back up. Okay, so you guys all know what diabetes is, right? Diabetes is when your insulin is not working. Your insulin is not working, and as a result, you have high concentrations of sugar in your blood. And when you have high concentrations of sugar in the blood, one of the primary ways your body tries to get rid of sugar is through the kidneys, through your pee, right? And so when we do the urinary system in AMP2, we'll learn all about how blood travels through the kidneys, and its job is to achieve homeostasis in the blood, not only with like pH balance, but also ion levels, sugar levels, all kinds of things. And when someone has diabetes, their blood sugar is constantly elevated really high, right? And so when you have hypoglycemia, you're going to get sugar in the urine because your body is trying to get rid of all this excess sugar. And so unfortunately, kids, for instance, these very young kids, like age even 3 or 4, can get type 1 diabetes. And when that happens, one of the sort of hallmark signs of it, unfortunately, is sugar in the urine, right? This kid is peeing all the time because they're producing a lot of urine because their body's trying to get rid of all this sugar. And when you pee all the time, you're going to dehydrate. When you dehydrate, you're going to be thirsty. So the kid gets really thirsty. So excessive thirst, excessive urination are sort of unfortunately hallmarks for a kid, for instance, that has diabetes, because their body is trying to filter out and get rid of all of this excess sugar. Okay? So there are 2 types of diabetes. You may be familiar with this. There's type 1 and type 2. And they're very different, actually. Most cases are type 2, actually. Type 1 is only about 5 to 10% of the cases. And we call type 1, it used to be called juvenile diabetes, because oftentimes it can occur in children, but also can be called insulin-dependent diabetes, because in type 1 diabetes, basically the beta cells that produce the insulin have been eliminated. It's sort of thought to be almost an autoimmune disease, where for whatever reason your body targets these islet cells, these beta cells that produce insulin, and eliminates them as if they were a foreign invader. And so someone with type 1 diabetes cannot produce insulin because they do not have the beta cells to produce them. And so we call that person insulin dependent, because they're going to need some other way, like injections of insulin or bolus of insulin or infusion pump, insulin pump, whatever, to get insulin in their system. Essentially, people with type 1 diabetes are going to have to sort of play their own pancreas, be their own pancreas, and figure out, okay, based on what I've eaten and how much activity I'm going to have, I need to give myself insulin. And so it could be multiple injections daily or a continuous infusion through an insulin pump. And these devices are becoming more and more sophisticated as this diabetes continues really to be a very significant problem in our society. And getting these really smart insulin pumps that can regulate based on blood sugar how much insulin should be released and can really be impactful. So this, again, accounts for only about 5-10% of the cases and often develops in childhood. Again, hence why we used to call it juvenile diabetes. But I think pretty much now the preferred nomenclature is type 1 diabetes. Now, the other is type 2, and this is non-insulin dependent, again, because people with type 2, typically their islet cells are still there. The beta cells that produce insulin are still there. It's just the insulin is not working properly. And we call that insulin resistance because the insulin is being released, but again, their tissues are really not responding. Sort of like the insulin is traveling through the bloodstream and coming to the muscle and coming to the liver and instructing the muscle and liver to pull the sugar into the cell, but the cells aren't listening. And so the sugar stays outside in the bloodstream and blood sugar goes up. And so oftentimes type 2 diabetes is associated with obesity, and weight loss and exercise can actually reverse it. Type 2 is oftentimes thought to be or can be reversible based on maintaining weight and exercising and eating right, whereas type 1 is not, right? Because type 1, you have no beta cells to secrete insulin. Here you still can if your cells, if you can restore that sensitivity to that insulin. So sometimes people take insulin sensitizers, like metformin, for instance, is an insulin sensitizer that helps the body. Now, type 2 isn't always associated with obesity. Sometimes people have genetic forms of it. There's gestational diabetes, which is a predictor of type 2 diabetes. So it's not always associated with obesity, but oftentimes it is. But fortunately, oftentimes also can be regulated and controlled pretty well with diet and exercise. And so how do you know if you have diabetes? Well, there's a pretty simple test. It's called an oral glucose tolerance test, or OGTT. Some of you may have had these. We used to use these in our clinic to establish that people had normal insulin action. And it's pretty simple. Basically, the person would come into the clinic, fasted overnight for 12 hours, and we'd get an initial blood test to see where their blood sugar is, right? And this would be a resting baseline blood sugar, and you'd figure after 12 hours of being fasted and not having eaten anything, 12 hours is a pretty significant amount of time, you'd hope that your blood sugar would be normal, right? And so that's really the first thing you look for. If your fasting blood sugar is greater than about 100 after, again, 12 hours, then that's your first sign that you probably have diabetes. And so this individual came in at 9 a.m., and the fasting blood sugar was 83.9. So that's good, right? It's below 100, in that normal range where we had hoped it would be. Then after that fasting blood sugar is taken, then we give the patient a glucose beverage or a glucose drink, right? It contains 75 grams of sugar, which is a pretty good amount of sugar. And we just sort of measure the blood sugar every 30 minutes over a 2-hour period to see what's happening, what is the body doing. And as you can see, the blood sugar is going up here, 116, 132, 146. But then by 2 hours, it starts to come down. And that's the other thing you look for, how quickly your body can process this sugar. So if at 2 hours your blood sugar is greater than 200, then that is your other sign that, in 2 hours you weren't really able to bring this sugar down. Now, this was a young normal in this test, and their blood sugar is sort of what we expected to see. This person did not have diabetes, and so their blood sugar came back to a reasonable range, much less than 200 after 2 hours. But those are really the two things you look for, and that's how you can determine if the person has diabetes, is based on this oral glucose tolerance test. Now, if you get diabetes, you're going to see many complications, unfortunately, if your diabetes is not managed properly. It could be kidney degeneration, retinal damage, heart attacks, peripheral nerve damage. We call the kidney degeneration like a diabetic neuropathy, right, where you see retinopathy damages, where you see hemorrhaging of the capillaries, which can damage the tissue. Early heart attacks because of blockages in the cardiac circulation. Peripheral nerve problems are quite common because of abnormal blood flow to these neural tissues because of the excess sugar in the bloodstream. These collectively are referred to as diabetic neuropathies. Oftentimes they hit like the feet, like for instance diabetics with poorly managed sugars oftentimes have feet issues with ulceration of the tissue, infection, maybe even loss of toes, or part of the feet might have to be lost as a result of this. So peripheral nerve damage is very common in poorly managed diabetes. Now, as I said, there are many other endocrine organs that have secondary endocrine functions. A lot of these we're going to look at AMP2. I'll just briefly run through these like the intestines can produce hormones that are important to coordination of digestive activities. The kidneys produce hormones that help with blood pressure in the renin-angiotensin system, but also we already talked about calcitrol and erythropoietin, which stimulates red blood cell formation. Also, the heart can produce natriuretic peptides, which help regulate blood pressure. The thymus can help maintain normal immune system and develop our healthy immune response. The gonads, the testes in the male, produce testosterone. The ovaries and the female produce estrogen, right? So we'll talk about a lot of those processes in AMP2. Hormones, as I said, really important to understand that most of these hormones seem to have what are called antagonistic effects. In fact, that they oppose one another, right? Like we saw with PTH and calcitonin, or insulin and glucagon, right? They do the opposite of one another, but they're being opposite of one another, they're still going to achieve homeostasis. But that said, they could also be synergistic or permissive, integrative effects, but most that we're going to see are going to be antagonistic. So there are several hormones that are important to growth, which we've talked about: growth hormone, insulin, PTH, reproductive hormones. Growth hormones can support normal muscular and skeletal development, also help maintain sugar and lipid concentrations. Thyroid hormone, we talked a lot about that already in terms of its production. Insulin is getting sugar into cells, right, so that the muscle can contract. We talked about PTH and calcitrol impacting bone density. Reproductive hormones, of course, are impacting skeletal proportion, sex characteristics, stimulating cell growth and bone density. We talked about that. Sex hormones can also impact behavior. And then hormones can also impact athletic performance, which obviously isn't as important, obviously, as these essential functions of growth and development. But you've all seen, like anabolic steroids used for bodybuilders, or unfortunately, like for baseball players, like Mark McGwire, admitted to using hormones to increase his muscle mass and muscle strength. EPO is erythropoietin. You can use that to stimulate red blood cell formation. Endurance athletes would use that, like Lance Armstrong used EPO to stimulate red blood cell formation, which is going to give them, higher oxygen carrying capacity, which is going to allow them to exercise aerobically for greater periods of time. And then in regards to aging and hormone production, the changes aren't as significant. Maybe growth hormone and reproductive hormones, obviously we see a change in. We've talked a lot about females losing estrogen and like the impact on bone density and other locations. But we don't see as many other changes. So anyway, so that's the endocrine chapter, and that is it, last chapter for the semester.